Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of STEM Nerds. I'm Jason. In today's video, we are going to be talking about the diversity of microbial life as an introduction to really the study of microbiology because there's so much out there. So before we even start talking about the different types of microbial life, I think it's important that we understand what makes something alive. And generally speaking, something that is alive is going to have all of these 8 characteristics. One, they're going to be made of cells, and we'll talk more about cells and what comprises cells in a future video, but they're made of cells. Living things are capable of reproducing. Living things will change over time, at least the populations will change over time. Living things need to be able to regulate their internal environments. Living things have order. They respond to environmental stimuli. They process energy, something that we'll talk about in a later video as well, and they grow and they develop. And so if there is something out there that can't do one or more of these things, it's not alive. One of the things that was really interesting back when my kids were younger, one of them brought home an assignment, and the question was, is a stick alive? A stick that you would find on the ground. And the answer, at least for his assignment, was yes. And I said, absolutely not. A stick is not alive. And then we went through the 7 characteristics of life. Is a stick made of cells? Well, it was at one time. Can a stick reproduce? No. A stick cannot reproduce. It's not going to change over time other than just break down. It doesn't have any regulation. It can't regulate its internal environment. It does have order because it was once a living thing. If you have a stick, it's not going to respond to the environment at all. It doesn't process energy. It is not going to grow and develop. And so therefore, a stick is not alive. Now, that's going to be really important. These concepts are going to be super important as we start to talk about microbial life and determining whether or not they are indeed alive. So there are 3 domains of life when we look at the hierarchy and the way that we classify life. And we're going to be really focusing on microbial life in this video. And so the first domain is bacteria. And these organisms are all single-celled. They're prokaryotic, and a prokaryotic organism is an organism that does not have a nucleus, right? A nucleus is an organelle, a membrane-bound structure that houses DNA. Bacteria, the vast majority of them, have cell walls, and they don't have any membrane-bound organelles. And so these little compartments inside of cells that hold specialized functions. The archaea is another domain. These are also single-celled, and they're also prokaryotic, meaning they lack a nucleus, they lack membrane-bound organelles. But what's different, what sets them apart from the bacteria, what's different about them is the fact that they live in extreme environments. When scientists first discovered these microbes, that's where they got their name. They thought they were archaic, the first life forms to ever exist. Turns out that's not exactly true. While they do live in extreme environments, they share a lot more similarities than originally thought with the eukarya, the group that we're going to be talking about next. They do have cell walls, but their cell walls look a little bit different when we compare them to bacteria. Finally, we've got the eukarya. Eukarya can be single or multicellular. That group includes us human beings, but there are microbes, believe it or not, single-celled eukaryotic organisms as well. And what that means, because they're eukarya, they do have a nucleus, and they do have membrane-bound organelles, things like mitochondria and smooth and rough ER, and organelles we'll talk about in a later video. The eukarya also tend to be larger, even when single-celled, relative to the bacteria and the archaea. So let's take a few minutes and talk about some of the microscopic eukaryotic organisms. First one being algae. Algae, the things that we should know about algae is they are photosynthetic. Process we'll talk about in a later video. They can be single or multicellular, and because they, again, are eukaryotic, they're going to have membrane-bound organelles, they're going to have nuclei. Now, as a whole, the algae need water. They're going to flourish in an aqueous environment. The fungi are another group of eukaryotic organisms that possess nuclei. They possess membrane-bound organelles. They, just like the algae, can be single or multicellular. One of their primary roles in an environment, in an ecosystem, is decomposition. They break down things that were once living. What's interesting about them as well is they have extracellular digestion. In other words, like we human beings, we eat food, it goes into our stomach, and we break it down in our stomach. Bacteria, protozoans, which we'll talk about in a little while, they bring food into their cells and they break it down inside. The fungi are a little bit different because what they do is they actually secrete digestive enzymes into the environment. The food breaks down extracellularly outside the cell, and then they bring in those macromolecules. The protozoans are another important group when it comes to microbiology. They are single-celled eukaryotic organisms that are part of a larger group called the protists. And I always joke with my students, yes, scientists are trying to classify the organisms within this group a little bit more clearly, but for the most part, when you look at the protozoans, they're eukaryotic, single-celled organisms that are not algae and not fungi. And a lot of them, importantly, can be parasitic. And so we've got a picture here of Giardia, which causes intestinal stress, things like diarrhea. And so the protozoans are something that was often covered in a parasitology class. In microbiology, we generally focus on bacteria and some on viruses. And the fungi, again, take mycology, something we talked about in the previous video, or if you want to learn more about protozoans, you take a parasitology course. So those were the living organisms when it comes to microbiology that we focus on. But now let's talk about things that maybe are not living, things like viruses. They are what is known as obligate intracellular parasites. In other words, they need a cell in order to survive. Those characteristics of life. Viruses are not made of cells. A virus outside of a cell, about the only thing it has is regulation and the ability to respond to environmental cues. Pretty much all of the other things that are required by a living entity, the viruses lack until they gain entry into a living cell. And so they need a cell in order to reproduce. They need a living cell for pretty much almost all of their macromolecules and building blocks to make more viruses. Viruses are made up of a capsid, a protein coat, and then inside that protein coat there is genetic material. And that's going to be either DNA or RNA, but not both. All living things, we have a DNA and RNA in our cells, but viruses have one or the other, and they are very, very tiny. With a few exceptions, viruses cannot be seen using a light microscope. They're going to be far smaller than prokaryotic cells. Now, a couple of the lesser known infectious agents, one is called a viroid. This is even smaller than a virus. It is infectious RNA. RNA is a type of genetic material that we talk about in a future video. And the viroids only infect plants. And then we have the infectious proteins. Yes, there are proteins that are infectious. The prion proteins, these are very unusual because we actually have a normal version of this protein in our brains. And when it's supposed to be there, it has a vital function. But these prion proteins, they can become denatured. They can change their shape. And when they do, they can be deadly. And so these prion diseases causes things like mad cow disease and Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. There is no cure for these diseases. And so once an animal or a human being contracts a prion disease, it is always fatal. Now, for human beings, the primary way, well, there's actually a couple different ways that we can contract the prion disease. One of them is hereditary, which is extraordinarily rare. And the other way is contracting it environmentally, usually through consuming an organism, well, that has a prion disease. We consume that through undercooked food. That's why when there's a mad cow disease outbreak, they usually get rid of all the cattle. They don't mess around. It's extraordinarily rare that we would actually contract that because the protein would have to pass through our circulatory system, get into the brain, which is not necessarily easy to do. But once it's there, it starts to break down the normal prion proteins, and that's what causes disease. One of the things I think that is absolutely critical for people to understand who are studying microbiology or just science in general are the relative sizes of the things that we talk about. Because sometimes we talk about stuff that's really small and hard to visualize, and we can lose where we're at in terms of life and the structure of life. And so this picture does a really good job of illustrating the different sizes and different components of things that make up life. And so I'm going to actually start at the bottom because I think it's easier to start at the bottom of this picture and work our way up. So the smallest thing that we're going to encounter are subatomic particles, things like protons, neutrons, and electrons. And yeah, there are things even smaller, but they're not something we need to discuss in a biology or microbiology course. And so protons, neutrons, and electrons are going to be the smallest thing that we're going to talk about. And those protons, neutrons, and electrons, those subatomic particles, will make up elements or atoms, things like hydrogen or nitrogen. And so those are going to be the next on the list. So you've got the subatomic particles, then you've got your elements, and then those elements can be combined, and when they do, they make molecules, things like O2 or ammonia or nitrite. And then once you have those things, you can combine those to make things like macromolecules, proteins, lipids, nucleic acids, carbohydrates. And once you have that, you can start making up more complicated things like, well, viruses, something we've talked about in this video. We said viruses, for the vast majority of them, are going to be very, very tiny, but then we work our way up, and the bacteria, things like E. coli, would be next. After that, you have single-celled eukaryotic organisms. So it might be a cheek cell or a muscle cell or yeast, if it's fungi, or a protozoan like Giardia that we talked about. And then once you have those, you can build those into multicellular organisms like worms and insects and flies and that kind of thing. And then this picture goes on and shows larger and larger things. But again, we're focused primarily on the microbial life. And so once we get past the cell, we'll not have to worry too much about the other ones. All right, everyone, so this was a quick introduction to microbes, the different types that are out there. The ones that we kind of focus on in microbiology, like I said, the vast majority are going to be bacteria. As always, thank you so much for being here. Hope you have a great week.